Monday, July 13th, 2020, Waterbury, Connecticut. At 9:36 a.m., police receive a panicked phone call from a New York resident.
Waterbury Police, dispatcher 428.
Yes, my friend, I'm calling because we can't get hold of my friend.
We get a call from a Galani Madongo, and he is located in Staten Island, New York at the time, and he's concerned for his girlfriend, Rachel Sabatala.
She lived in Waterbury and worked in the area past the CNA.
I last spoke to her on Friday night.
Was there anything wrong?
We had just had a notification,
You guys got into an argument then?
Yes.
He reported that he had an argument with her and hadn't heard from her in 2 days.
Okay, you're looking to do a wellness check?
Yes.
All right, we're going to send an officer out there as soon as possible.
Our patrol division responds to Rachel's apartment.
Nobody was home, so a landlord allowed them access into the apartment, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary.
And at that point, we learned Rachel had a roommate.
But she had been away for weeks as a traveling nurse.
Rachel's roommate hadn't heard from her.
We reach out to all the hospitals in the area, and Rachel wasn't there.
As soon as police arrive back at headquarters, they reach out to Rachel's family to gain more insight into the 33-year-old's life.
Rachel's parents, they lived in a remote part of South Africa, and they would wait by the phone for an arranged phone call they had each week, typically 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. on Sundays. And around July 10th, the Sunday following, she never called.
And we spoke to her sister, who also informed us that she hadn't heard from her for a period of time as well.
Obviously, they were very concerned. It was not, her normal being to not make contact. So try to, piece together who she was and learn about her life and what she did.
Born and raised in Ikahang, South Africa, Rachel Lorado Sebetlela moved to the United States in 2012.
She was here working at various jobs to support her family back home.
I first met Rachel back in, I would say, late 2019, early 2020. She was a nurse's aide. She used to live in New York, and then she came down to Connecticut. We worked as caregivers, and I worked for a nursing agency caring for elderlies. And Rachel did the same thing. She got along with everyone that she worked with. Everybody loved Rachel because she was very quiet, very reserved. But once she got to know you and open up to you, then it was just welcoming. And to spend time with Rachel, you will love her because she always had this beautiful smile on her face, very jovial, very, very fun. I saw Rachel the week before, and she told me she was going to be taking time off for her birthday. I was looking forward for her coming back. So as the time went on, I realized that she was not back. And I kept querying, where is she? Why is she not back? When more than a week went on, we were just like, wait a minute. It's a little kind of weird because she doesn't take off that long unless she's going back home.
Over the course about the next couple weeks, there's calls from a few more friends expressing some concern.
So the officers thought it best to file a missing persons complaint.
We were able to put a ping out on Rachel's phone to try to locate her, but there was nothing coming back. The phone is off. There's no signal.
As Waterbury detectives dig deeper into Rachel's life, they discover that she had filed a report with the New York City Police Department just 3 days before Galani reported her missing.
At this point, all we had was that her and Galani had a domestic issue right around July 10th.
Galani lived in Staten Island. She had been spending some time with him there on her break from work.
So a handful of detectives responded out to Staten Island, spoke with the NYPD.
There was a confrontation, an argument, and Rachel called the police.
Knowing the history that they just had a domestic, we were concerned that Galani could have potentially been involved in Rachel's disappearance.
According to the report, Rachel claimed she feared for her life when a screaming match broke out between the couple.
So there was a police response from NYPD of an argument they had, and we were able to view some body camera footage from the New York officers that showed Rachel leaving there from New York.
She did end up taking a ride back to the city of Waterbury, and we were able to confirm that ride through her Uber records.
So we started to tighten our time frame as to when something possibly could have happened to her here in Waterbury.
6 weeks pass with no new developments in Rachel's disappearance, so detectives attempt to locate Rachel's cell phone again.
We did a ping again, and this time we were getting a location, and that ping was coming back to Galani's residence. So now we were highly suspicious.
Detectives immediately travel to Galani's New York apartment. Inside, they find Galani, but Rachel is nowhere to be found.
They make contact with Galani, but he explains that he was actually the owner of Rachel's phone.
He tells detectives that he had taken the SIM card out of her phone and replaced it into another phone.
So it wasn't Rachel using the phone, he was using it.
He definitely wasn't helping his cause by removing SIM cards. We thought, was he trying to cover his tracks?
So that made us that much more suspicious of Galani.
However, detectives see no sign of foul play at Galani's residence.
So our initial thoughts were that maybe Galani was involved in, harming her, but we didn't have the evidence we need to figure out what happened to her.
We don't have a body, so we're just trying to really figure out what's going on at this point.
Over the next month, concerns continue to mount.
Then in the end of August of 2020, her roommate, who had been out of town for some time, came home.
When she made her way back to the apartment, she realized that something seemed off.
I believe plastic bags, paper towels were missing. There was a rug near the bathroom area that was missing.
She even thought that there may have been some blood splatter by the sink area. It alarmed her enough to call us.
We ended up doing a search and seizure warrant for Rachel's apartment. And when we executed that search warrant, our forensic division assisted us with that.
Forensic technicians sprayed some luminol, and it was positive for a blood-like substance.
There was blood splatter seen on a radiator, in the cabinets near the sink, and some on the floor as well. There's a tremendous amount of blood showing up through these agents in her kitchen.
We begin to really realize that foul play is involved.
And although we don't have a body, as an investigator, that tells us that something definitely happened in that kitchen, and it appeared that somebody attempted to clean up a crime scene potentially.
He was more than a missing person. Now it was treated as more of a homicide.
Coming up, a harrowing discovery in the woods confirms detectives' worst fears.
Looks like a cavity. Taped up, legs are taped up.
And as the search for a killer intensifies, a deadly affair becomes the focus of the case.
She was a jealous female, and at that point they began planning her death.
More than a month after Rachel Sebet-Layla was reported missing by her boyfriend Galani Madongo, traces of blood have been discovered in her apartment, suggesting that a violent attack occurred inside.
Once we see the amount of blood that's there, we're starting to lean more towards a homicide investigation at this point. But we don't have a body.
There weren't really any breaks in the case until September 12th.
Watertown Police Dispatch.
Okay. In Black Rock.
You're in Black Rock?
Yeah. I think I found a dead body.
Black Rock is located in Watertown, Connecticut. It's a town over from us here in Waterbury. The area is right off the highway.
It's a desolate area. There's not a lot of people around there.
Somebody walking in the woods believed he discovered human remains.
Watertown police call neighboring departments to see if they have any missing people, and that's why they called Waterbury PD.
We thought, is there a chance that this could be Rachel? So we sent major crime detectives out there.
You guys found something?
Yeah.
All right, what did you see?
Legs, and you can see Helen with a foot, like bone.
Like a person?
Like a human?
Yeah.
And you called right away?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The body is discovered at the bottom of an embankment.
Bones. That's Lars come down, seeing if he wants us to touch.
Yeah.
It was wrapped in a series of blankets and black trash bags.
It looks like a human cavity. This is a shirt?
Yeah, taped up. Legs are
Taped up?
Okay. Yeah, legs are taped. It looks.
It was badly decomposed. The hands were bound, the feet were bound.
The state of decomposition suggests that the body has been there for 2 months.
All right, I'm gonna pull out where the head would be. Oh yeah, it's definitely a skeleton.
We got there.
Oh yeah, it's human. I don't see a head.
I don't see a head, sir.
There was no head attached to the torso.
They do a general search of the entire area, seeing if they could find additional remains. 30 or 40 feet away, they found the remains of her skull.
But it was badly decomposed, making it difficult to determine who the person could be. But one detective did recognize the fingernails.
During the course of the investigation, we recovered one of Rachel's iPads. And when we looked through the iPad, she had taken a selfie. And in that selfie, she had those exact same fake nails.
It was a very distinctive manicure. Her nails were painted in green and yellow.
So we had a strong feeling that it was Rachel.
The body was brought to the office of the chief medical examiner, and we were able to identify those remains as Rachel's.
So an autopsy was completed, and we determined that Rachel had suffered from multiple stab wounds. So we knew the death was horrific.
What was indicative of her being stabbed was that the shirt she had on her had 17 defects. And there's also a rib that was nicked, and there were cuts in her diaphragm. All this evidence indicated to law enforcement that she died in the apartment and her body was dumped after that.
It's believed that the head was detached from animal activity.
Following the autopsy, detectives make the difficult call to Rachel's family in South Africa.
Rachel's family, once they learned of Rachel's death, they were obviously shocked, obviously saddened.
I heard about it at work, and we all broke down. We all started crying. We were a complete shock. There will be no reason for her to be murdered.
When we see the results of the autopsy and we see how many times Rachel's stabbed, it's an indication that it's very personal and potentially a crime of passion.
So our thought was it was someone close to her.
Galani was a person of interest. He was the last person that had seen her. He had reported her missing.
When detectives call Galani in for questioning, they break the news of Rachel's death to him.
He was extremely upset at the circumstances that are disclosed.
Galani insists he had nothing to do with Rachel's murder. However, he does reveal one detail he had previously withheld from detectives.
He stated earlier in the year, he discovered that Rachel was having an affair with another individual, Miles Johnson.
They had met at a job. They both worked together and had struck up a relationship.
Galani found out about the initial affair through Rachel's telephone. Galani and Rachel spoke about it. Rachel told Galani that they were no longer seeing each other. But later in the year, Galani, through Rachel's phone, saw that there was still contact with Miles.
He had discovered text messages on her phone between Rachel and Miles, reconfirming they had started their relationship again.
He had had an argument with Rachel, but he set that no matter what, he'd still loved her and he was trying to make amends.
We're gathering all this information that's leading us to believe that Galani's responsible for what happened to Rachel.
With no direct evidence tying him to Rachel's death, police allow Galani to walk after he provides a written statement.
They felt that he was believable. Maybe he was, in fact, just a concerned boyfriend. So at this point in the investigation, we kind of put Galani on hold for a bit.
Detectives immediately turn their attention to Miles Johnson, the man with whom Rachel was allegedly having an affair.
Law enforcement is able to find Miles Johnson because they pull Rachel's call log, the last people that she was in contact with before she disappeared, and they find that the last number that she talked to was Miles Johnson.
So from there, we made contact with Miles Johnson, and he agrees to come in and speak with detectives.
It just turned our investigation into a different angle.
Less than a week after 33-year-old Rachel Sebet-Leila's remains were found in a Connecticut state park, police have learned she was having an affair with her co-worker, Miles Johnson. On September 18th, detectives interview Miles.
We didn't give Miles any indication that Rachel was dead at the moment. I explained to him how we have concerns for Rachel, how she's been missing, and we're just wondering what he might know at this point.
And we start to learn a little bit more about some of the things that were going on in his life at that point in time.
The 22-year-old worked as a phlebotomist in Waterbury.
I started working with Miles in December of 2019 at the very end. We were mobile phlebotomists, so our job was to go in different locations and take blood samples from people. You get to meet all new sorts of new people, and he was a very personable person. Miles got along with everybody. He just had this presence, and he actually had wanted to eventually become a doctor.
While Miles began to work there, we all kind of will congregate together during certain social activities inside the facility. So it was a time to really get to know him. His mother was from Jamaica and his father was Spanish.
He was a pretty cool guy, actually. Very fun to talk to. He was an all-around pretty likable guy. And he was an attractive young man. And the other phlebotomists, they fawned over him when he started.
Miles and Rachel started out as friends. It was never anything serious in the beginning. And as time went on, the communication intensified.
Their work relationship evolved into a sexual relationship.
She liked Miles. She liked where it was going. Rachel was older than Miles, so she would make jokes and says, okay, my young thing is calling me.
In February of 2020, he said to me that he was trying to find something, that he wanted to get this particular girl something for Valentine's Day. And I says, oh, I didn't know you had a girlfriend. And he says, no, we're just kind of seeing each other. But she has another guy, and this guy is kind of a jerk, and he keeps trying to get between us.
Miles Johnson was having a relationship with Rachel, but he too had a girlfriend at the time, while Rachel was obviously in a dating relationship with Galani.
So Miles Johnson and Cassandra Nazario were dating for a period of time, maybe over the course of a couple years.
It seems like, Miles was trying to cover his tracks, trying to maybe keep his relationships open with both women.
So we asked him if he had any kind of contact with Rachel around July 10th, July 11th. And that's when he indicates that on July 10th, he was caught by Galani Madongo. On that day, Galani reached out to him and began to tell him how he found out about the relationship. And then Miles acknowledged making a phone call to Rachel at midnight, but he denied being at Rachel's apartment around that time or even being in the area.
When detectives reveal that Rachel has been found murdered, Miles is seemingly taken off guard.
He was shocked, so there wasn't too much suspicion. He was cooperative.
He denied any involvement in Rachel's murder.
At this point, we just don't have too much information that would point us in the direction of Miles. So we eventually reach out to his girlfriend, Cassandra, because we know that there seems to be some sort of love triangle, and she's involved in it.
She went down to the police department voluntarily, and they asked her about herself.
23-year-old Cassandra Nazario was born and raised in the Bronx.
Cassandra really never got in trouble. She was an exceptional student. She was like a bubbly person. She's really funny, very playful, very curious, and free. And as an adult, she was just wanting to be successful and help people. So she got into healthcare. She started working as a certified nurse's assistant.
Both Miles Johnson and Cassandra Nazario were working together.
I did not know Cassandra very well. She did not work alongside me or Rachel. She was new into the mix.
I first heard about Miles when she came and brought him over and we met him. And he was quiet, but Cassandra seemed happy. I think she was in love, or what her interpretation was of being in love, and she enjoyed being in a relationship with him.
When detectives asked Cassandra about her boyfriend's affair with Rachel, Cassandra admits she knew.
Cassandra explains to detectives that Galani had reached out to her and, told her that, listen, there's an affair going on with your boyfriend and my girlfriend.
She seemed to be very upset at Miles because she stated to me that she was a very good girlfriend to him.
Detectives asked her about her involvement in this, and she denied any involvement, and she actually gave an alibi to Miles Johnson, saying they were home watching movies the night Rachel went missing.
So at that point in time, we kind of left it at that with her.
In order to eliminate the two men in Rachel's life as persons of interest, detectives subpoena both Miles and Galani's phone records.
They received information about location data from those phone records.
Technology has advanced so far in investigations over the last several years that, it's able to pinpoint humans wherever they are.
Galani's cell phone records indicated that he was not near Waterbury at the time. We believe that this occurred.
Cell phone data from his cell phone showed that he never left Staten Island. After that, Rachel's boyfriend was quickly ruled out.
However, when detectives review Miles's location data, they discover that he had in fact visited Rachel's apartment the night she disappeared.
At around midnight, July 10, we see his location going from Rachel's apartment right down to the area of Black Rock State Park where the remains were found.
Officers at that point believed that he was much more involved than he was initially indicating.
Coming up, a suspect breaks under interrogation.
He states that she becomes very aggressive. At one point, she's trying to hit him, and then at another point, he states she grabs a knife.
And as the pressure mounts, lovers begin to turn on each other.
They were really trying to point the finger at each other.
God is the only judge. But in life, you have to pay for your consequences.
Detectives have discovered evidence that 22-year-old Miles Johnson was likely the last person to see Rachel Sebet Layla alive before she went missing in July 2020.
The night that she goes missing, Miles' cell phone puts him at Rachel's apartment. And then during that night, his cell phone also pings near the area of Black Rock State Park where the body was recovered. It's a strong evidence to suggest that Miles was involved in Rachel's murder.
On September 23rd, detectives bring Miles in for a second round of questioning.
I ask him about having something more to do with Rachel the night of July 10 into the 11th, and he was just adamant that he did not see her, he wasn't there. It was right around 4 hours of the interview, I eventually have to start confronting him with what we found on his cell phone.
Detectives were showing he was near the area where the body was dumped.
His response is that someone either hacked his phone or took his phone. It couldn't be him.
It's not probable that your cell phone was hacked and they decided to input locations where human remains were found. So he has no real answer for any of the serious questions that I'm asking him. He's just really deflecting.
Eventually, towards the very end of the interview, he said he might have taken a romantic drive with his girlfriend out to that location, but he didn't really recall. And then shortly thereafter, he invoked his right to remain silent and chose not to speak any further.
So with the facts and circumstances we had up to this point, especially the technology aspect of it, the cell phone, we were able to secure an arrest warrant for Miles.
So at that point in time, he was served with his arrest warrant and he was sent to our booking area. Miles' reaction was really non-existent. He didn't have a, hey, that's not me, I didn't do it. He didn't have a upset reaction.
The following morning, while he's in the holding area, he sees me and he asks to speak with me again.
He wants to share some more information on Rachel and what happened to her.
So I bring him back to an interview room and I talk with him. Now during this interview is when he really starts to get Cassandra involved in the homicide.
Miles was kind of laying out how Cassandra was extremely upset at the circumstances that are disclosed to her about, the intimate relationship that Miles is having with Rachel.
So Miles tells me that right around midnight on July 10th, him and Cassandra Nazario go to Rachel's apartment, and he just wanted to talk to her about the relationship, kind of break it off and try to smooth everything over. He states Cassandra was waiting on the steps just outside the door. He states that when he confronts Rachel and he's having this conversation, she becomes very aggressive. And at one point, she's trying to hit him, and then at another point, he states she grabs a knife. Miles tries to tell me that him and Rachel are now struggling over this knife. And then he tells me that during this struggle, he describes Rachel kind of plunging the knife into her own neck. When he's telling me this, I'm not even remotely believing it, but I'm just letting him go on with it. You know, sometimes it's better to just let them keep talking and they're just gonna dig their own hole. Eventually, Cassandra comes into the apartment as well.
Mr. Johnson said Cassandra Nazario had come up into the apartment, and while Rachel was suffering from her knife wound, Cassandra had stabbed her several times and killed her. So Mr. Johnson tried to lay the blame of the murder completely at the feet of Cassandra Nazario. And he said she was a jealous female and was jealous of Rachel, and for that reason she had killed her.
Once Rachel is clearly dead, him and Cassandra proceed to tie her hands and feet together, and she was then wrapped in a series of black plastic bags and blankets. From there, they cleaned up the apartment and went to Black Rock State Park.
After Miles finishes his story, he's returned to lockup.
When I heard Miles was arrested, it was really shocking because he didn't give off the abusive, aggressive vibes, the type of person who you would consider to be a murderer. We couldn't believe, because all of us worked alongside Miles and Rachel. So it was a little bit strange.
Learning this new information that Miles provided to us, now Cassandra, she's in deep water. He has just, implicated her in this crime that really is involving him and his relationship with Rachel. So detectives were able to apprehend her, bring her back into the police department, interview her.
Detectives confront Cassandra with Miles's story.
She responds that she felt very much betrayed by him. She felt that she was the type of girlfriend who gave him everything over the years and he really gave her nothing back. So Cassandra stated that she wasn't taking the fall for it.
I believe her words are, "I don't want to go down for this." And at this point, she tells officers her version of events.
It just really turns into a blame game.
In September of 2020, Connecticut detectives are investigating the murder of Rachel Sebit-Layla and talking to 23-year-old Cassandra Nazario for the second time.
She indicated that she was not going to take the hit for what Miles Johnson had done, and then she gave a different version of events.
On July 10th, 2020, Rachel's boyfriend, Galani, calls Cassandra after he finds out about Rachel and Miles' affair.
When Cassandra found out about that, it fueled a lot of jealousy, it fueled a lot of hurt for her.
Cassandra says she confronted Miles immediately, which led to an explosive argument.
Her and Miles were having an argument based on Miles still being with Rachel.
She says they went for a drive to cool down later that night.
She stated that she wasn't aware that they were going to Rachel's at the time, but they end up outside of an apartment building, which turns out to be Rachel's.
Miles Johnson had gone to confront Rachel and tell him they were breaking up.
Then she follows Miles up the stairs to Rachel's apartment. She stated that Miles then went into the apartment.
She tells detectives that she initially does not go in the apartment.
She was waiting outside and she heard screaming and struggling.
Cassandra then states that she eventually hears the arguing stop, which makes her a little curious, and so she goes up to the door, and when she opens it up, she sees Rachel on the ground, Miles on top of her, with a knife in his hand.
She sees that Rachel has been stabbed.
There was just blood everywhere within the kitchen.
She indicated that Mr. Johnson told her to get a pillow because Rachel was still gurgling. She brought the pillow over to Miles Johnson and that he had finished killing her by suffocating her.
She claims to be in shock, now realizing that there's not much she could do. So she agrees then to help clean up and dispose of the body.
Cassandra tells us that her and Miles carry Rachel's body down the stairs to his SUV. Cassandra tells us that they drive out to Black Rock. Rachel is then dragged to the guardrails, and then she is pushed underneath the guardrails down an embankment into the woods. Cassandra states that once the body was dumped over at Black Rock, the two of them stop at a gas station. It was either for cigarettes or food in some capacity. And then from there, they go back to Miles Johnson's house, where they proceed to take off all their clothes, some of the cleaning supplies they use, and they burn them in a fire pit in his backyard. I have no reason to believe that she's not being truthful because the details were very gruesome. She didn't seem to really be holding anything back.
Once we learn of Cassandra's disclosures to detectives about her role in the homicide, we secured an arrest warrant for her, so she's, brought to court and she's arraigned.
Even though she didn't commit the crime, she was part of the crime, so Cassandra is still charged with Rachel's murder.
I really couldn't believe it. And, I know sometimes things happen outside of our control, but I was devastated. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. The first time I spoke with her, I feel like it was that night that I got the call they gave her. And I was hysterical, she was hysterical. And I just told her I'm gonna hire her an attorney.
In a case of he said, she said, authorities know that obtaining a conviction against both Cassandra and Miles may not be easy.
You got to make a deal with somebody, because juries are tricky and it's a chance you're taking.
At that point, offers were made for pleading guilty. Those offers were rejected by Mr. Johnson. His case was scheduled for trial, but Cassandra Nazario's attorney had indicated a willingness to cooperate with the state against Miles Johnson. At that time, we thought her only involvement was when she went into the apartment, she had gotten a pillow and given it to Miles Johnson, and then Miles Johnson had done all of the killing. So we were willing at that point to make a cooperation agreement where she'd still be punished on her manslaughter and use her testimony against Miles Johnson. When we met with Cassandra Nazario, the first thing we talk about in any cooperation agreement is you have to be completely truthful and completely honest. If you're not truthful and honest, we cannot use you, we will not use you.
At that point, she tells us her final version of what happened.
And I think then, her mind starts to change gears a little bit, that she needs to tell the truth.
After arresting Cassandra Nazario and Miles Johnson for the murder of Rachel Sebit Layla, authorities offer Cassandra a cooperation agreement in exchange for the truth. Cassandra tells prosecutors that it all started when Galani told her about Miles and Rachel's affair on July 10th. She alleges he also dropped 2 more bombshells.
Galani started telling Cassandra things like Rachel's pregnant with Miles' baby.
Cassandra, I guess, had been trying to get pregnant, but just wasn't able to. So this was extremely hurtful to Cassandra. She wanted so bad to start a family with Miles.
And at some point he said that Rachel may have transmitted to them a sexually transmitted disease.
According to Cassandra, this detail in particular made Miles furious.
They were upset about this, and that was their reason. Mr. Johnson decided that Rachel, quote, she must die. And at that point, they began planning her death that day. They had gone to several different stores that day, buying stuff to clean up the crime scene and to dispose of the body.
And they buy knives, they buy black clothing, and at night, they go to Rachel's house.
Miles Johnson went in first. He had a struggle with her. He stabbed her. At that point, Mr. Johnson involved Mr. Nazario in the murder. He said, I want you to stab her. Mr. Nazario said, I did.
She indicated that she proceeded to stab her multiple times.
We had told her she had to be honest, and she was, that she had been equally culpable in the killing. This was certainly new information we had, and based on that, we couldn't really make a deal with her for a manslaughter. There was no way we could not prosecute her for murder, since she's as equally involved as Miles Johnson. We had conversations with her lawyer after that. He agreed to plead guilty to murder, and she would testify against Miles Johnson.
So after we get this information from Cassandra, we take another look at the cell phone records.
And those phone records corroborated Cassandra's version, where they had gone to different stores that day.
In April 2023, Miles Johnson's case goes to trial.
During the trial, Miles was really trying to point the finger at Cassandra being the ringleader of the entire incident.
The nature of Mr. Johnson's defense was that Mr. Johnson was a victim of circumstance and that Rachel actually stabbed herself in the neck and that Cassandra Nazario had come in and killed her because she was jealous.
Miles definitely did blame it all on her. And I just thought, you're not taking any accountability. And she definitely took accountability for her role.
I think the primary motive in this case was that Miles Johnson and Cassandra Nazario were under the impression that Rachel may be pregnant and that there may be a sexually transmitted disease that was passed on to them.
When in fact, the autopsy confirmed Rachel was not pregnant.
And she didn't have a sexually transmitted disease.
I can only speak in my opinion that Miles and Cassandra must have had a tumultuous relationship prior to this happening. And when things like this happen, there's an affair involved and there's emotions involved. It doesn't take much to set these little things off and start a storm.
So Cassandra Nazario testified as to all the involvement she had, Mr. Johnson had, and then that was corroborated by the ME reports, the cuts in the clothes, the cell phone data records. We put on the best case we possibly could. But until they come back and say guilty, you're always going to be nervous about it.
In late April, the trial concludes.
The jury was out for about 10 hours, and the verdict was guilty on all counts against Miles Johnson. Miles Johnson was sentenced on August 2nd, 2023 to 55 years.
On August 14th, Cassandra Nazario was sentenced on the murder charge she had pled guilty to. She received a sentence of 25 years, which was the mandatory minimum sentence in Connecticut.
God is the only judge. But in life, you have to pay for your consequences. Someone lost their life, you need to be in jail.
You know, it's a terrible, tragic event, but in my opinion, justice was served in this case.
Rachel was young. She was full of life. There was no reason to have taken hers. For Rachel, there's just so much memories of Rachel that I just can't pick one. There really isn't. She was a great person, so a lot of things to remember her by. As the beautiful, fun-going, lovable person that she was.
On the morning of June 20th, 2018, emergency responders arrived at a modest home in Lancaster, a quiet desert community in northern Los Angeles County where rows of similar houses stretched beneath a cloudless California sky. From the outside, there was little to distinguish the residents from countless others scattered across the neighborhood. Cars moved through nearby streets. Neighbors went about ordinary routines. The dry summer wind carried dust across empty lots, and the relentless desert sun illuminated every corner of the quiet suburban block. Nothing about that morning suggested that the house standing before them had become the final chapter in one of the most devastating child abuse cases California had seen in years. Inside, however, lay a 10-year-old boy fighting for his life. His body told a story long before investigators would piece together timelines, interview witnesses, or examine official records. Bruises covered old bruises. Fresh injuries overlapped scars that had already begun to fade. Signs of prolonged starvation stood beside evidence of repeated physical violence. Medical personnel worked desperately, but almost immediately they understood they were not looking at the aftermath of an ordinary household accident. They were looking at a child whose suffering had not begun hours earlier. It had unfolded over months, perhaps years, hidden behind walls that countless adults had approached but failed to truly enter. That little boy was Anthony Avalos. Within 24 hours, Anthony would be gone. His death would ignite public outrage across California. Prosecutors would later describe unimaginable acts of torture committed against a child who should have been protected by the very adults responsible for his care. Court proceedings would reveal horrifying evidence that stunned even experienced detectives, physicians, and prosecutors who had spent careers investigating violent crimes. Yet as shocking as the injuries themselves were, another truth would prove even harder for the public to accept. Anthony's death had not arrived without warning. It had announced itself again and again over the course of 5 long years. Teachers noticed. Relatives noticed. Neighbors noticed. School officials noticed. Social workers noticed. Deputy sheriffs documented concerns. Emergency calls were made. Reports were filed. Investigations were opened. Questions were asked. Files grew thicker. Names appeared repeatedly inside county databases. Each report represented another opportunity. Another chance to interrupt the violence before it escalated beyond recovery. Another moment when someone believed something was terribly wrong inside Anthony's home. Still, the little boy remained there. The warnings accumulated faster than the protection. Years later, as court documents became public and investigative journalists reconstructed the timeline, one painful question echoed across Los Angeles County. How could a child surrounded by so many warning signs still die inside the very home everyone feared was dangerous? The answer was far more disturbing than a single act of cruelty. Anthony Avalos' story was not simply about one abusive household. It became a story about a system built to protect vulnerable children but repeatedly failing to recognize when intervention could no longer wait. Agencies that existed to safeguard children found themselves under intense scrutiny. Decisions that once seemed routine were examined under a microscope. Reports that had been quietly filed away suddenly carried unbearable weight because everyone reading them knew how the story would end. Looking backward, every missed opportunity appeared painfully obvious. Looking forward, none of those opportunities could ever be reclaimed. Anthony was born on May 4, 2008. Like every newborn, he entered the world carrying no understanding of danger, betrayal, or fear. Children begin life believing that adults will feed them when they are hungry, comfort them when they cry, and protect them from harm. Trust is not something children choose, it is something they instinctively give. For Anthony, that trust would eventually become one of the greatest tragedies of his short life. As investigators later reconstructed his childhood, they discovered a pattern that had become almost routine inside the household. Violence was not an isolated explosion of anger. According to prosecutors, it had become woven into daily life. Punishments blurred into torture. Discipline transformed into humiliation. Fear became ordinary. Children often adapt to unimaginable environments because they have no other reality against which to measure their own lives. What appears horrifying to outsiders can slowly become normal to a child who wakes each morning expecting another day of uncertainty. Smiles grow cautious. Words become fewer. Eye contact disappears. Survival replaces childhood. Anthony still attended school. He still encountered teachers. He still crossed paths with adults capable of recognizing signs of abuse. Many did. Some documented bruises. Others noticed dramatic behavioral changes. Several worried about unexplained injuries. Concern spread beyond classrooms into official agencies. Yet every intervention proved temporary. Every return home meant another opportunity for violence to continue behind closed doors. To understand why Anthony's case continues to haunt California years after his death, it is necessary to recognize that the tragedy did not unfold in secrecy. This was not a mystery hidden from the outside world until one catastrophic night exposed everything. Instead, it unfolded in fragments visible to dozens of people. Each individual saw only one piece of a much larger picture. One noticed bruises. Another heard troubling statements. Someone else observed fear. Another documented neglect. Only after Anthony died were those scattered fragments assembled into one devastating image. Investigators would eventually examine years of hotline reports, school records, law enforcement contacts, medical observations, and child welfare assessments. Together they painted a heartbreaking portrait of escalating danger. Standing alone, each report appeared concerning. Viewed together, they described a child trapped inside a cycle that was becoming increasingly violent. The realization shook public confidence. People asked how 16 separate reports could still leave one child unprotected. Others wondered why repeated allegations never produced lasting intervention. Questions spread beyond courtrooms and government offices into living rooms across America. Parents imagined their own children. Teachers reflected on students they worried about. Social workers revisited difficult decisions. Police departments examined investigative procedures. The story no longer belonged only to Anthony's family. It belonged to every institution responsible for protecting children. But before there were investigations, lawsuits, headlines, or courtroom verdicts, there was simply a boy. He liked playing. He laughed with his siblings during better moments. He dreamed the way children dream, without understanding how fragile childhood could become when the adults surrounding them abandoned their responsibilities. That ordinary humanity is sometimes lost beneath the horrifying details repeated in news reports. The injuries become statistics. The legal charges become headlines. The court testimony becomes evidence. Anthony risks becoming remembered only for the way he died. Yet before becoming the center of a criminal investigation, he was a child who deserved birthdays, school memories, friendships, safety, and unconditional love. Those ordinary experiences never should have been extraordinary privileges. They should have been guaranteed. As prosecutors later stood before jurors describing the final days of Antony's life, they argued that the violence reached unimaginable levels. The evidence would ultimately convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that what happened inside that Lancaster home was neither accidental nor sudden. It reflected sustained abuse culminating in fatal injuries. Those responsible would eventually face justice. They would spend the remainder of their lives behind prison walls. For many observers, however, those convictions answered only one question. Who caused Antony's death? They did not answer another question that lingered even after the verdicts were read. Who could have prevented it? That question would become the heart of Antony Avalow's legacy. It would drive lawsuits, independent reviews, policy reforms, and painful public conversations about institutional responsibility. It would force Los Angeles County to confront uncomfortable truths about communication failures, investigative standards, and the enormous challenges of protecting children whose suffering often remains hidden in plain sight. Antony's story is therefore not only a true crime investigation. It is also a case study in missed opportunities. It is the story of warning signs that multiplied until they became impossible to ignore, but only after a child had already paid the highest possible price. And to understand how so many alarms could sound without changing the outcome, we must return to the beginning, long before the emergency call, long before the courtroom, and long before the nation learned the name Antony Avalos. There, inside what should have been an ordinary childhood, the first signs of a tragedy waiting to unfold had already begun to appear long before Antony Avalow's name appeared in headlines across the United States, long before prosecutors stood before a jury describing months of unimaginable abuse, and long before county officials faced difficult questions about their own failures. There was a city that appeared remarkably ordinary. Lancaster sits in the western Mojave Desert, roughly 70 miles north of downtown Los Angeles. To many people driving through Southern California, it is simply another growing community connected by long highways stretching across dry valleys and distant mountain ranges. During summer, the heat can feel relentless. Temperatures often climb well above 100 degrees, transforming sidewalks into shimmering ribbons beneath the afternoon sun. The wind carries fine desert dust through neighborhoods where identical homes stand side by side, their small front yards decorated with rocks instead of grass to conserve water. For families seeking more affordable housing than Los Angeles itself could offer, Lancaster represented opportunity. New developments expanded across the desert during the early 2000s. Young parents arrived hoping to build stable lives. Children filled neighborhood parks after school. School buses followed familiar routes every weekday morning. From a distance, it looked like the kind of place where childhood could unfold quietly. Yet like every growing community, Lancaster contained stories that outsiders rarely saw. Economic hardship touched many households. Parents worked multiple jobs. Some families struggled with unstable relationships, substance abuse, untreated trauma, or financial insecurity. Behind garage doors that closed each evening, every family carried burdens invisible to passing neighbors. Antony Avalos was born on May 4, 2008. He entered a large family that included several brothers and sisters. A busy household can often be loud, chaotic, and full of energy. Children compete for attention, share bedrooms, argue over toys, and create constant movement throughout the day. Under healthy circumstances, that chaos is balanced by affection, routine, and security. But according to evidence presented years later, stability was something Antony would rarely experience. The adults responsible for shaping his earliest memories instead created an environment ruled by unpredictability. Children instinctively learn the emotional climate of their homes. Some learn that laughter is welcomed. Others learn that silence is safest. Some run excitedly toward the sound of a parent's footsteps. Others freeze the moment they hear a key turning in the front door. Investigators would later conclude that Antony belonged to the second group. Inside the home, moods could change without warning. Punishments did not always follow misbehavior. Sometimes they appeared arbitrary. Sometimes they escalated far beyond anything a child could understand. As years passed, fear slowly replaced normal childhood expectations. Outside the home, However, Anthony appeared much like thousands of other elementary school students throughout Los Angeles County. He attended school. He completed assignments. He interacted with teachers. He spent time around classmates. Those daily routines became some of the only moments when adults outside his household could observe changes in his physical condition or emotional well-being. Teachers occupy a unique position in child protection. Unlike emergency responders who arrive only after something terrible has happened, teachers witness gradual changes over weeks and months. They notice when a child suddenly becomes withdrawn. They recognize unexplained bruises appearing repeatedly. They hear comments that seem unusual. They observe who consistently comes to school hungry, exhausted, frightened, or anxious. In Anthony's case, several educators became concerned. Some noticed injuries. Others observed behavior that suggested something deeper than ordinary childhood struggles. Mandatory reporting laws required those concerns to be documented. Reports began moving through official channels. Each report carried hope that trained investigators would determine whether intervention was necessary. Unfortunately, filing a report does not automatically remove a child from danger. Every allegation must be evaluated. Investigators attempt to distinguish misunderstandings from genuine abuse. Parents are interviewed. Children are questioned. Homes are visited. Evidence is gathered. The system is designed to balance two difficult responsibilities. It must protect children from real danger while avoiding unnecessary removal from families based on false accusations. Most of the time, that balance is extraordinarily difficult. Anthony's story would later demonstrate just how devastating the consequences can become when warning signs accumulate faster than decisive action. The home itself did not attract widespread public attention before Anthony's death. Neighbors later described seeing children playing outside from time to time. Some recalled hearing arguments. Others noticed unusual behavior but assumed authorities were already handling whatever problems existed. This assumption is surprisingly common. When people know that police have visited a home or that child welfare workers have conducted interviews, they often believe the situation is being addressed. Responsibility quietly shifts. Individuals stop asking whether they should call again because they assume someone else already has. In Anthony's case, many people did call again. And again. And again. Years later, investigative records would reveal that concern surrounding the household never completely disappeared. Instead, it resurfaced repeatedly. One report described physical abuse. Another described neglect. Another raised concerns about starvation. Another mentioned injuries. Different people observed different pieces of the same disturbing pattern. Yet no single observation fully revealed the scope of what was happening inside. That is one of the greatest challenges in child abuse investigations. Children rarely experience abuse in front of large audiences. The violence occurs privately. Witnesses encounter only fragments. One teacher sees bruises. A neighbor hears shouting. A relative notices fear. A deputy documents an injury. A social worker conducts a brief interview. Each person leaves with only one chapter of a much larger story. Anthony's complete story remained scattered across countless documents filed over several years. Only after his death would investigators assemble those records into a single timeline. The result was heartbreaking. The warnings formed a nearly continuous thread running through much of Anthony's childhood. Meanwhile, life in Lancaster continued normally. Children walked to school beneath bright blue skies. Parents attended youth sports events. Families shopped at grocery stores. Birthday parties filled neighborhood backyards during warm weekends. Ordinary life continued only blocks away from extraordinary suffering. This contrast often unsettles people studying true crime. Many imagine violent crimes occurring in isolated places, abandoned buildings, or neighborhoods already known for danger. Reality is often different. Some of history's most disturbing crimes unfolded in ordinary suburban homes where mail was delivered every afternoon, lawns were trimmed every weekend, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings over backyard fences. Anthony's home existed within that uncomfortable reality. Its appearance revealed little. Its walls concealed everything. Inside those walls, according to prosecutors, punishments became increasingly cruel. Anthony was allegedly deprived of food. Water was reportedly withheld. He was forced to stand or kneel for long periods. He endured repeated physical assaults. Investigators later documented allegations that he had been burned with cigarettes, suspended upside down, and forced into degrading acts no child should ever experience. The abuse, prosecutors argued, was not driven by discipline. It reflected domination. The destruction of a child's sense of safety. Children depend entirely upon adults. They cannot leave dangerous homes. They cannot rent apartments. They cannot seek employment. Their survival depends on the same people who may be hurting them. That dependence creates one of the cruelest aspects of child abuse. The person causing fear is often the same person responsible for food, shelter, and comfort. Love and terror become hopelessly intertwined. Experts who later examined Anthony's circumstances noted that children living under prolonged abuse often develop extraordinary coping mechanisms. Some become unusually quiet. Others attempt to predict adult moods. Many blame themselves. Some stop asking for help after repeated disappointments. Whether Anthony experienced those exact psychological responses cannot be known with certainty. What is known is that multiple adults became concerned enough to report suspected abuse. Those reports alone reveal that signs of danger were visible. The adults who interacted professionally with Anthony did not simply overlook him. Many recognized that something appeared terribly wrong. Yet recognition alone proved insufficient. The machinery of child protection moved slowly. Investigations opened and closed. Assessments were completed. Explanations were accepted. The household remained together. As months became years, Anthony grew older. His body carried more injuries. Official files accumulated more reports. Questions increased. Answers remained elusive. Looking backward today, the progression appears tragically clear. At the time, however, each new report entered a system already handling thousands of allegations across Los Angeles County every year. Caseworkers faced enormous workloads. Deputies balanced countless responsibilities. Investigators made decisions using incomplete information gathered under significant time pressure. Understanding those systemic pressures does not excuse failure. But it helps explain why Anthony's case eventually became far larger than a single criminal prosecution. His death forced public attention onto the institutions surrounding his family. Attention shifted from what happened inside one house to what happened inside government offices where reports were reviewed, risks were assessed, and decisions were made. The questions became deeply uncomfortable. Why were repeated warnings unable to produce lasting protection? Why did different agencies fail to assemble scattered information into one coherent picture? Could better communication have changed the outcome? Could stronger intervention have saved a child's life? Those questions would dominate public discussion for years. But before investigators examined institutional failures, before civil lawsuits sought accountability, and before juries weighed criminal evidence, there remained one essential story still waiting to be told. Who was Anthony Avalos beyond the headlines? Who was the little boy hidden beneath medical reports, investigative files, and courtroom exhibits? To understand the true weight of everything that followed, we must first meet Anthony not as a victim, but as a child whose life held the same promise, innocence, and quiet dreams as any other 10-year-old. Only then can the full tragedy of what was taken from him truly be understood. Before Anthony Avalos became the focus of a homicide investigation, before his name appeared in court records and newspaper headlines, he was simply a little boy trying to find his place in a world that should have felt safe. He was born on May 4, 2008, into a large family in Los Angeles County. Like countless children, Anthony entered the world completely dependent on the adults around him. Every smile he offered, every question he asked, and every dream he quietly imagined rested upon one simple expectation, that the people who cared for him would also protect him. For many children, that expectation is never questioned. Home is where scraped knees are kissed, nightmares are comforted, and birthdays are celebrated with laughter. For Anthony, home would become something entirely different. Children have an extraordinary ability to find joy in the smallest moments. A cardboard box can become a spaceship. A patch of dirt can become a construction site. A walk to school can become an adventure. Adults often underestimate how resilient children are, believing that happiness disappears completely when hardship enters their lives. The truth is often far more heartbreaking. Children continue searching for moments of happiness even while living in fear. That resilience, admirable as it is, sometimes hides the depth of their suffering. By all available accounts, Anthony was a gentle child. Those who encountered him outside the home described someone who was quiet, polite, and eager to please. He was not known for causing trouble. He was not the child constantly disrupting classrooms or seeking attention through aggressive behavior. Instead, he often appeared reserved. Children living in abusive environments frequently become experts at reading other people's emotions. They learn to recognize changes in tone. They notice footsteps. They study facial expressions. They attempt to predict whether the next few minutes will bring calm or danger. Over time, caution becomes second nature. Smiles become measured. Words become carefully chosen. Silence feels safer than mistakes. No one can know exactly what Anthony thought as he moved between school and home each day. What is documented, however, is that many adults noticed signs suggesting he carried burdens no child should bear. Teachers observed injuries. School personnel noticed concerning changes. Mandatory reports were filed because experienced educators believed something was wrong. School often serves as one of the few consistent environments in the lives of abused children. Inside classrooms, expectations remain predictable. There are schedules, rules, lunch periods, recess, assignments. Children know what tomorrow is supposed to look like. For Anthony, those hours away from home may have represented the closest thing to stability he experienced. Yet even there, pieces of his private suffering gradually surfaced. Bruises cannot always be hidden beneath clothing. Exhaustion reveals itself through heavy eyes. Hunger affects concentration. Fear changes the way children interact with classmates and adults alike. The signs were present. The challenge lay in understanding how dangerous the situation had truly become. Anthony lived with multiple siblings. Large families often create natural companionship among brothers and sisters. Children invent games together. They protect one another. Older siblings comfort younger ones. They share secrets adults never hear. But when violence enters a household, those relationships can become complicated. Fear spreads through every room. One child's punishment becomes another child's warning. Silence becomes an unspoken rule. According to prosecutors, the abuse inside Anthony's home extended beyond isolated incidents. It became part of daily life. Investigators later uncovered allegations that Anthony was routinely deprived of food. He was reportedly denied water as punishment. He was forced to stand or kneel for long periods. He was allegedly struck repeatedly with belts and other objects. There were allegations that he was forced to eat food taken from the trash. Authorities also documented claims that he had been burned with cigarettes and suspended upside down. Each allegation painted another layer of a childhood stripped of ordinary comfort. Yet perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of prolonged child abuse is not the physical pain. It is the gradual erosion of identity. Children begin believing they deserve what happens to them. They blame themselves for punishments they cannot understand. They apologize for existing. Instead of asking, "Why are they hurting me?" They begin asking, "What did I do wrong?" Experts in child psychology have long explained that abusive households often reshape a child's understanding of love itself. Affection becomes unpredictable. Kindness may appear briefly before disappearing without explanation. Punishment arrives without warning. Eventually, children stop trusting their own judgment. What feels frightening becomes normal. What should feel safe becomes unfamiliar. Anthony's case would later reveal another heartbreaking reality. Despite everything happening inside the home, he continued trying to live the life of an ordinary child. He attended school. He interacted with teachers. He was surrounded by classmates whose greatest worries might have been homework or playground disagreements. The contrast is difficult to comprehend. A child carrying unimaginable fear still completed everyday routines alongside children living completely different lives. It reminds us that abuse often remains invisible. Victims rarely wear signs announcing what happens after they leave school. They board the same buses. They stand in the same lunch lines. They laugh occasionally. They answer attendance. To the casual observer, they simply appear quiet. Anthony was only 10 years old. 10. An age when children are still discovering who they are. Some dream of becoming astronauts. Others imagine careers as firefighters, athletes, teachers, or artists. Many spend evenings watching cartoons or building imaginary worlds with toys. Childhood is supposed to be filled with possibilities. Anthony's possibilities became increasingly limited by survival. According to later testimony presented in court, punishments inside the household grew harsher over time. Basic necessities reportedly became tools of control. Food could be withheld. Water denied. Rest interrupted. The ordinary comforts every child deserves allegedly became privileges granted or taken away according to the moods of adults. Such conditions affect far more than physical health. Starvation slows growth. Sleep deprivation clouds thinking. Constant fear floods the body with stress hormones that alter emotional development. Children living under prolonged trauma are not merely frightened. Their entire understanding of the world changes. Trust becomes dangerous. Hope becomes fragile. Still, Anthony continued reaching out in small ways. One of the most widely discussed moments in the case came during the final days of his life. According to prosecutors, Anthony told his mother that he liked boys. He was only 10 years old. Children often begin expressing early feelings or asking questions about identity without fully understanding the social significance adults may attach to those conversations. Whether Anthony fully understood what he meant is impossible to know. What matters is how the adults around him allegedly responded. Prosecutors argued that this disclosure became one factor leading to an escalation of violence inflicted upon him by Kareem Laver, with Heather Barron participating in the abuse rather than protecting her son. For many people following the trial, that allegation carried profound emotional weight. Parents are expected to provide unconditional protection. Children should never fear rejection for expressing who they are. Instead, according to the prosecution's evidence, Anthony encountered the opposite. The home that should have offered acceptance allegedly became even more dangerous. The tragedy resonated deeply with advocates for abused children and LGBTQ youth alike. Regardless of motive, Anthony remained what he had always been, a 10-year-old child entirely dependent on adults for safety. Nothing could justify the suffering described in court. As investigators later interviewed Anthony's siblings, prosecutors assembled a clearer picture of daily life inside the household. Those interviews became some of the most painful evidence presented during trial. They suggested that violence had become normalized within the family. Children described punishments that no child should ever witness, let alone experience. For investigators, such testimony transformed isolated allegations into a consistent pattern. Patterns matter. In criminal investigations, one unexplained bruise may raise concern. Years of repeated injuries, multiple independent reports, and consistent witness accounts reveal something far more disturbing. Anthony's life, when reconstructed piece by piece, revealed a pattern stretching across much of his childhood. It was not defined by one terrible day. It was defined by countless ordinary days during which opportunities for rescue quietly slipped away. Yet reducing Anthony's story solely to abuse risks overlooking something essential. He was more than what happened to him. He laughed. He learned. He grew. He experienced moments of curiosity and imagination common to children everywhere. Those moments deserve remembrance because they remind us what was stolen. When discussing victims of violent crime, it is easy for their identities to become overwhelmed by forensic evidence. Medical terminology replaces personality. Court exhibits replace memories. Photographs become evidence rather than snapshots of childhood. Anthony deserves to be remembered differently. He deserves to be remembered first as a little boy whose future should have included middle school, high school graduations, friendships, first jobs, and adulthood. Instead, his future ended before his 11th birthday. The years he never lived became part of the tragedy itself. As June 2018 approached, the violence inside the household, according to prosecutors, intensified to levels that even seasoned homicide investigators would later struggle to comprehend. The final chapter of Anthony's life was about to unfold. The warnings had already been given. The reports had already been filed. The opportunities to intervene had already come and gone. Now, inside the walls of a quiet home in Lancaster, a sequence of events was beginning that would forever transform one family's history, expose profound institutional failures, and leave an entire community asking how a child seen by so many could remain beyond the reach of protection until it was far too late. By the middle of June 2018, summer had settled over Lancaster with its familiar intensity. The mornings arrived bright and dry. By noon, the desert heat shimmered above the pavement, blurring the horizon in waves of rising air. Air conditioners hummed inside homes across the neighborhood while children looked forward to the freedom that summer vacation usually promised. For most families, June marked the beginning of longer days, late sunsets, and time spent together. Inside Anthony Avallo's home, according to prosecutors, those same days became the final and most violent chapter of his life. The evidence later presented in court suggested that what happened was not a sudden explosion of anger lasting only a few minutes. Instead, investigators argued that Anthony endured escalating abuse over a period of days before emergency services were finally called. By then, it was already too late. The prosecution alleged that Anthony's suffering intensified after he shared something deeply personal with his mother. According to testimony presented during trial, Anthony told Heather Barron that he liked boys. He was only 10 years old. Children often express thoughts and feelings without fully understanding the significance adults may attach to them. At that age, conversations about identity are frequently marked by curiosity rather than certainty. Whatever Anthony intended to communicate, prosecutors argued that his words were met not with reassurance or compassion, but with hostility. According to the prosecution, Heather Barron relayed Anthony's statement to Kareem Laver. What should have remained a private conversation between a child and a parent allegedly became another reason for violence. The courtroom would later hear allegations describing an atmosphere where punishment rapidly escalated into brutality. Anthony was no longer simply a child living in a difficult home. According to prosecutors, he became the target of sustained physical abuse that grew increasingly severe over the following days. The exact sequence of every injury can never be reconstructed with complete certainty. Medical examiners, investigators, and prosecutors pieced together events through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and interviews conducted after Anthony's death. Their reconstruction described a horrifying pattern. Anthony was allegedly thrown to the ground multiple times. He was reportedly struck repeatedly. Evidence presented during trial described him being hit with a belt and electrical cords. Prosecutors also alleged that hot sauce had been forced into his mouth as part of the abuse. Food continued to be used as a weapon rather than nourishment. By itself, any one of these allegations would have represented serious child abuse. Taken together, prosecutors argued they revealed prolonged torture inflicted upon a 10-year-old child. The physical injuries accumulated faster than his small body could recover. Every bruise represented bleeding beneath the skin. Every blow placed additional stress on organs already weakened by previous abuse. Every passing hour reduced the chances that he could survive without immediate medical intervention. Children possess remarkable resilience. Their bodies often recover from injuries that might surprise adults. That resilience, however, has limits. Repeated trauma overwhelms even the healthiest child. By June 2018, according to medical evidence, Anthony had reached those limits. Inside the home, the ordinary rhythms of life continued around him. Meals were prepared. People moved between rooms. Conversations took place. To the outside world, nothing suggested that one child inside the house was suffering catastrophic injuries. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of many child abuse cases. Extraordinary violence often unfolds alongside ordinary routines. Neighbors mow lawns. Delivery drivers leave packages. Cars pass through quiet streets. Life continues only a few feet away from unimaginable suffering. As investigators later examined the timeline, they focused carefully on the hours before emergency responders were finally summoned. According to prosecutors, Anthony's condition deteriorated dramatically. Head trauma became increasingly severe. He struggled physically. His body showed signs that demanded urgent medical attention. Yet help did not come immediately. Time matters enormously in cases involving traumatic brain injuries. Minutes can determine whether swelling inside the skull becomes survivable. Hours can mean the difference between recovery and irreversible damage. Medical experts later testified that Anthony's injuries were not consistent with a simple household accident. Instead, they reflected repeated blunt force trauma occurring over time. As his condition worsened, Anthony could no longer conceal the extent of his injuries. Whatever strength had carried him through earlier episodes of abuse was disappearing. Eventually, on June 20, 2018, emergency services were contacted. The call reported that Anthony had fallen. At first glance, such explanations are not uncommon in emergency dispatches. Children fall from bicycles. They slip on stairs. They suffer accidental injuries while playing. Paramedics respond to those calls every day. But experienced emergency personnel are also trained to recognize when injuries do not match the explanation being offered. When responders arrived, they encountered a child in critical condition. Anthony was unresponsive. The severity of his injuries demanded immediate medical intervention. Every second became precious. Paramedics worked rapidly, stabilizing him as best they could before transporting him for emergency treatment. Even before physicians completed extensive examinations, experienced medical professionals understood that the situation was extraordinarily serious. Anthony's injuries extended far beyond what one would expect from a simple fall. Doctors began documenting bruises covering multiple areas of his body. Some injuries appeared recent. Others were older, indicating repeated episodes of trauma occurring over time. Forensic medicine often reveals truths that words cannot hide. The human body records violence with remarkable precision. Bones heal. Bruises change color. Internal injuries develop according to recognizable patterns. Physicians trained in child abuse medicine understand how to distinguish accidental injuries from those resulting from repeated assaults. As Anthony underwent emergency treatment, those distinctions became increasingly clear. Despite every effort made by medical staff, the damage was overwhelming. Severe traumatic brain injuries had placed enormous pressure on his body. Internal bleeding complicated treatment. Years of alleged neglect and malnutrition further reduced his ability to recover. Doctors continued fighting to save him. Meanwhile, law enforcement officers began asking difficult questions. Whenever a child's injuries appear inconsistent with the explanation provided, investigators have a duty to examine every possibility. They documented the condition of the home. They photographed evidence. They interviewed adults present. Medical findings quickly transformed what initially appeared to be a medical emergency into a criminal investigation. The focus shifted from how Anthony had been injured to who had injured him. As detectives compared witness statements with medical evidence, inconsistencies began to emerge. The explanation of an accidental fall failed to account for the extensive pattern of injuries observed throughout Anthony's body. Old bruises stood beside fresh ones. Healing wounds existed alongside catastrophic new trauma. Taken together, they suggested something far more disturbing than a single accident. Investigators widened the scope of their inquiry. They examined Anthony's medical history. They reviewed prior contacts involving the family. They requested records from child welfare agencies. Each new document revealed another piece of a much larger story. The emergency unfolding in the hospital was not isolated. It represented the culmination of years of warning signs. Back at the hospital, Anthony remained surrounded by physicians, nurses, and specialists determined to save his life. For medical professionals, cases involving critically injured children carry a unique emotional burden. Their responsibility is to focus entirely on treatment. Yet they cannot ignore what repeated injuries reveal. Every bruise tells part of a history. Every fracture has a timeline. Every medical finding contributes to understanding what happened before the child reached the emergency room. Anthony's injuries spoke with devastating clarity. The following day, June 21, 2018, Anthony Avalos died. He was 10 years old. The official cause of death reflected catastrophic injuries resulting from prolonged abuse rather than an isolated accident. His death marked the end of his suffering. It also marked the beginning of an investigation that would expose years of missed opportunities by multiple institutions responsible for protecting vulnerable children. News of Anthony's death spread quickly among investigators already familiar with aspects of the family's history. As agencies began comparing records, a deeply troubling realization emerged. Many of the names involved were already known. Previous reports existed. Prior allegations had been documented. Concerns had been raised repeatedly. The homicide investigation was no longer focused solely on identifying those directly responsible for Anthony's fatal injuries. It also began uncovering the institutional history surrounding his life. Questions expanded beyond the walls of the house. What had earlier investigations found? Why had previous reports failed to produce lasting protection? How many opportunities had existed to intervene before June 2018? Those questions would soon become central to one of California's most closely examined child abuse cases. But before prosecutors could present their evidence before a jury, detectives first faced the painstaking task of reconstructing Anthony's final days, hour by hour, injury by injury, statement by statement, until the full picture of what had occurred inside that Lancaster home finally began to emerge. By the afternoon of June 20, 2018, the atmosphere inside the hospital had changed. When Anthony Avalos first arrived, every member of the emergency team focused on one objective: keeping a 10-year-old boy alive. Questions about what had happened would come later. In those first critical moments, medicine always comes before investigation. Doctors stabilized his airway. Nurses monitored his vital signs. Specialists evaluated the extent of his head injuries. Every minute mattered. But as the examination continued, another reality slowly emerged. Anthony's condition could not be explained by a simple accident. The emergency physicians were trained to recognize patterns. They had treated children who had fallen from bicycles, climbed trees, slipped on wet floors, or suffered injuries during sports. They understood how accidental trauma usually appeared. Anthony's body looked different. The injuries were not isolated to one area. They were everywhere. Some bruises were dark and fresh. Others had already begun changing color as they healed. There were injuries in different stages of recovery, suggesting they had not occurred all at once. To experienced physicians, that detail was profoundly significant. Bodies tell time. Every bruise, every wound, every healing fracture follows a predictable biological process. Medical experts can often estimate whether an injury occurred hours earlier, days earlier, or even weeks earlier. Anthony's body reflected a history rather than a single event. As more physicians joined the examination, concern quickly transformed into certainty. Hospital staff contacted law enforcement. They also initiated procedures required whenever severe child abuse is suspected. From that moment forward, two battles unfolded simultaneously. Doctors continued fighting to save Anthony's life. Investigators began searching for the truth. Inside the emergency department, the mood grew increasingly heavy. Medical professionals become accustomed to trauma. They witness devastating injuries throughout their careers. Yet cases involving children affect even the most experienced staff differently. A seriously injured child forces everyone in the room to confront an uncomfortable reality. Children cannot choose where they live. They cannot remove themselves from dangerous homes. Their safety depends entirely upon adults. As Anthony lay unconscious, surrounded by machines and specialists, his injuries silently described months, perhaps years, of suffering. No child should have carried so many scars before reaching the age of 10. Outside the treatment rooms, detectives arrived. They began documenting every available fact. Who had called 911? Who had been inside the home? When had Anthony last appeared healthy? What explanation had been provided for his injuries? Initially, investigators approached the case as they would any suspicious child injury. They listened carefully. They avoided premature conclusions. Evidence, not assumptions, would determine the direction of the investigation. The explanation offered, that Anthony had fallen, quickly encountered serious problems. Medical findings did not align with that account. A fall might explain one injury. It could not easily explain the extensive collection of old and new trauma covering his body. Nor could it account for signs of prolonged neglect. Detectives recognized that they were confronting something far more complicated than a single tragic accident. While officers remained at the hospital, other investigators traveled to the family's residence in Lancaster. The neighborhood looked almost unchanged from every other summer afternoon. Children played outside several houses away. Vehicles moved quietly through residential streets. The bright California sun illuminated sidewalks and driveways with almost painful clarity. Nothing about the exterior suggested the horror investigators believed had unfolded inside. Crime scenes involving child abuse rarely resemble those portrayed in television dramas. There are no dramatic signs announcing where violence occurred. Family photographs still hang on walls. Children's toys remain scattered across bedrooms. Laundry waits to be folded. Dinner dishes may still sit in kitchen sinks. Ordinary objects become deeply unsettling precisely because they exist beside extraordinary cruelty. Investigators entered the home knowing that every room might contain evidence. Photographs documented the condition of each area. Measurements were taken. Potential evidence was carefully collected. Nothing was considered too insignificant. In homicide investigations, tiny details often become critically important weeks or months later. An object ignored today may answer an essential question during trial years afterward. Every investigation begins by preserving possibilities. As detectives moved through the residence, they searched for anything capable of confirming or contradicting witness statements. They noted the layout of the home. They documented sleeping arrangements. They examined areas where abuse was alleged to have occurred. Meanwhile, forensic specialists prepared to process physical evidence using scientific methods that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. At the same time, another team began interviewing individuals connected to the family. Neighbors described what they had seen over the years. Some remembered hearing arguments. Others recalled children who rarely appeared outside for long. Several expressed sadness that something terrible had happened. Many had no idea how severe the alleged abuse had become. This pattern appears repeatedly in child abuse investigations. People notice fragments. Very few see the complete picture. One neighbor hears shouting. Another notices bruises. A teacher observes unusual behavior. A relative receives an alarming phone call. Each person carries only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Only investigators possess the ability to assemble every fragment into one timeline. As interviews continued, detectives requested records from multiple agencies. Almost immediately, the investigation expanded beyond the events of June 2018. Child welfare reports began arriving. School records followed. Law enforcement contacts surfaced. Each document carried dates stretching back years before Anthony's death. Detectives soon realized they were not examining an unknown family suddenly caught in tragedy. The household had repeatedly attracted official attention. One report described suspected physical abuse. Another raised concerns about neglect. Another mentioned injuries. Still another questioned whether the children were receiving adequate care. The documents accumulated rapidly. By themselves, individual reports might appear inconclusive. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. The same child's name appeared again and again. Anthony Avalos. The discovery stunned investigators. Every previous report represented an earlier opportunity to understand the danger inside the home. Each investigation had generated information. Each contact had left behind paperwork. Now, following Anthony's catastrophic injuries, detectives were reading those files through the painful lens of hindsight. Questions multiplied. Why had repeated allegations failed to produce lasting intervention? Were earlier investigations incomplete? Had critical information failed to reach decision-makers? Did different agencies possess pieces of evidence without recognizing how those pieces connected? Those questions would eventually extend far beyond the criminal case itself. But first, investigators needed to establish exactly what had happened during Anthony's final days. Medical evidence became central. Forensic pathologists conducted an exhaustive examination after Anthony died on June 21, 2018. Their findings would become some of the most powerful evidence presented during trial. The autopsy documented extensive blunt force injuries. Severe trauma to the head had caused catastrophic brain damage. Internal bleeding confirmed the violence inflicted upon his small body. Evidence of malnutrition further demonstrated prolonged neglect. Perhaps most significant, the examination identified numerous injuries of varying ages. Some wounds were recent. Others had partially healed. Together, they established that Anthony had not suffered one isolated episode of violence. He had endured repeated abuse over time. Pathologists distinguish between accidental injury and inflicted trauma through careful scientific analysis. Patterns matter. Location matters. Healing stages matter. Anthony's injuries displayed characteristics inconsistent with the explanation that had initially accompanied the emergency call. The medical evidence supported the conclusion that this was a homicide resulting from prolonged physical abuse. For detectives, the autopsy transformed suspicion into certainty. The investigation shifted fully toward identifying criminal responsibility. Attention centered on the two adults responsible for Anthony's care, his mother, Heather Barron, and her boyfriend, Kareem Laver. Interviews became more detailed. Investigators carefully compared statements against physical evidence. Inconsistencies emerged. Timelines changed. Explanations evolved. Experienced homicide detectives understand that truthful accounts generally remain consistent even under repeated questioning. False accounts often require adjustment as new evidence appears. Every interview therefore served two purposes. It gathered information. It also tested credibility. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued examining physical evidence recovered from the residence. Although much of the prosecution's case would ultimately rely upon medical findings and witness testimony rather than dramatic forensic discoveries, every item collected helped strengthen the overall reconstruction of events. No single piece of evidence solved Anthony's case. Instead, hundreds of facts reinforced one another. Medical findings matched witness accounts. Historical record supported recent allegations. Prior reports explained older injuries. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. As detectives reconstructed Anthony's final weeks, they also interviewed his siblings. Those interviews required extraordinary care. Children who witness abuse often carry profound emotional trauma. Investigators used specialized techniques designed to minimize additional psychological harm while obtaining reliable information. The statements provided by family members became an essential component of the prosecution's case. According to later court proceedings, those accounts described a household where severe punishment had become normalized. Their testimony helped investigators understand that Anthony's final injuries represented the culmination of an established pattern rather than an isolated outburst. By the end of the first stage of the investigation, detectives faced a heartbreaking realization. Anthony's death was entirely preventable. Not because investigators had failed after June 20th. They had acted quickly once the emergency call revealed the severity of his condition. The tragedy lay elsewhere. It rested in the years preceding that call. Years during which warning signs repeatedly surfaced. Years during which teachers, relatives, neighbors, social workers, and deputies all encountered pieces of Anthony's story. Years during which intervention remained incomplete. The homicide investigation therefore uncovered two separate crimes. One occurred inside the walls of a Lancaster home. The other was less visible. It unfolded through missed opportunities, fragmented communication, and institutional failures that allowed a vulnerable child to remain in danger despite repeated warnings. As detectives organized thousands of pages of reports, photographs, medical records, and interview transcripts, they understood that prosecuting the individuals directly responsible for Anthony's injuries would be only part of the story. The evidence was beginning to expose something much larger than one family's violence. It was revealing how a child could become known to multiple agencies, generate years of documented concern, and still slip through every layer of protection designed to keep him safe. That discovery would soon transform a homicide investigation into one of the most scrutinized child protection failures in California history, setting the stage for an inquiry that reached far beyond the crime scene itself and into the very institutions entrusted with safeguarding children like Anthony Avalos. The death of Anthony Avalos marked the end of one investigation and the beginning of another. The first sought to answer a straightforward criminal question. Who was responsible for the injuries that claimed the life of a 10-year-old boy? The second asked something far more difficult. How had those responsible been allowed to reach that point despite years of warnings? As homicide detectives continued assembling evidence, the case expanded rapidly beyond the walls of the Lancaster home. It became impossible to investigate Anthony's final days without also examining the years that came before them. Every document seemed to point backward. Every witness remembered an earlier concern. Every medical finding suggested that the violence had not begun in June 2018. It had been building for years. Detectives assigned to the case understood that successful homicide investigations rely on chronology. Events must be reconstructed carefully. Not simply the day of the crime. Every significant event leading toward it. In Anthony's case, that timeline stretched back to early childhood. Investigators requested records from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, commonly known as DCFS. They also reviewed reports generated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, school officials, healthcare providers, and mandatory reporters who had interacted with Anthony over the years. Boxes of files began arriving. Electronic records were recovered. Hotline reports surfaced. Case notes appeared. Each document represented a moment when someone had believed Anthony might be in danger. As detectives organized the material, one fact became immediately clear. Anthony's family was not unknown to child welfare authorities. Far from it. His name appeared repeatedly. According to official records, between 2013 and 2018 there had been numerous reports alleging abuse or neglect involving Anthony and other children in the household. Teachers reported suspicious injuries. Neighbors described troubling behavior. Relatives contacted authorities. School personnel expressed concern. Mandatory reporters fulfilled their legal obligations by notifying child protection agencies whenever they believed a child faced possible abuse. Each report entered a system responsible for determining whether intervention was necessary. At first glance, individual reports often appeared limited. One described bruises. Another mentioned hunger. Another questioned whether the children were being adequately supervised. One investigation might conclude without enough evidence for immediate removal. Another might identify concerns but recommend monitoring rather than emergency action. Viewed separately, each decision reflected the information available at that particular moment. Viewed together, years later, those reports revealed something much more disturbing. The warning signs never truly stopped. They simply continued accumulating. One of the earliest incidents reviewed by investigators involved an injury Anthony reportedly attributed to Kareem Laver. According to records later examined during public investigations, Anthony had told a deputy sheriff that Laver had pulled his ear hard enough to cause injury. The responding deputy documented the allegation. The report moved through official channels. Yet prosecutors and later reviews concluded that no comprehensive criminal investigation followed. The case eventually closed without charges. Standing alone, that incident may not have predicted the future. Placed within the broader timeline, however, it became one more missed opportunity among many. Detectives studying Anthony's history found themselves reading document after document carrying similar themes. Children allegedly being hit. Food reportedly withheld. Punishments described as excessive. Visible bruising. Emotional distress. Fear. Again and again, different individuals documented concerns. Again and again, Anthony remained in the home. The homicide investigation gradually transformed into an examination of institutional communication. No single agency possessed every piece of information simultaneously. DCFS maintained child welfare records. LASD maintained law enforcement reports. Schools documented educational concerns. Medical professionals recorded physical findings. Each organization collected valuable information. The challenge lay in connecting those fragments before tragedy occurred. Investigators began interviewing social workers involved in previous cases. Their task was not to assign immediate blame but to understand decision-making. What information had been available? What risk assessments had been completed? Why had earlier investigations concluded without permanently removing Anthony from the home? The answers proved complicated. Child protection operates under difficult legal standards. Removing children from parents requires evidence sufficient to justify extraordinary government intervention. Authorities must balance protecting children against preserving family integrity whenever safely possible. That balance becomes extraordinarily difficult when evidence appears incomplete or conflicting. Anthony's case would later raise painful questions about whether warning signs that seemed manageable individually should have appeared overwhelming when considered collectively. Attention also turned toward Kareem Laver. Investigators examined his relationship with the household. Witnesses described his role within the family. Detectives explored allegations of previous violent behavior. Every aspect of his background became relevant. At the same time, investigators scrutinized Heather Barron's actions. As Anthony's mother, she held a legal and moral duty to protect her child. Instead, prosecutors alleged she participated in abuse and failed to seek timely medical care despite Anthony's worsening condition. Understanding her decisions became essential to explaining how Anthony's injuries progressed unchecked. Experienced homicide investigators often speak about victimology, the careful study of a victim's life. Rather than beginning with suspects, they begin with the victim. Who were they? How did they live? Who surrounded them? What patterns shaped their daily existence? Anthony's victimology painted an unmistakable picture. He was a vulnerable child. Dependent. Unable to leave. Unable to protect himself. entirely reliant upon adults. That reality fundamentally shaped every aspect of the investigation. Unlike adult homicide victims who may encounter strangers, acquaintances, or unknown offenders, child abuse investigations almost always begin within the household. Statistics consistently show that children face the greatest risk from adults entrusted with their care. Anthony's case tragically followed that pattern. As investigators continued interviewing witnesses, another important theme emerged. Many people believed someone else had already solved the problem. Teachers assumed child welfare agencies were intervening. Neighbors believed repeated reports would eventually result in meaningful action. Relatives expected authorities to recognize the seriousness of the situation. Each person acted. Each believed professionals would complete the next step. Yet responsibility became fragmented. This phenomenon has been studied extensively in complex institutional failures. When multiple organizations share responsibility, accountability can become diluted. Everyone contributes information. No one fully owns the outcome. Anthony's case would eventually become an example cited by child welfare experts discussing the dangers of fragmented systems. The homicide investigation also relied heavily upon forensic medicine. Medical experts worked closely with detectives to reconstruct the probable sequence of injuries. They explained which wounds appeared older, which injuries proved fatal, how repeated trauma differed from accidental injury. Their conclusions reinforced the prosecution's emerging theory. Anthony had suffered prolonged abuse culminating in catastrophic head injuries shortly before emergency services were contacted. No credible medical evidence supported the explanation of a simple fall. Every new finding narrowed the possibilities. Every inconsistency strengthened the criminal case. Gradually, prosecutors became confident they possessed sufficient evidence to pursue the most serious charges available under California law. But before formal charges were announced, investigators continued one final task. They reconstructed Anthony's last known movements almost hour by hour. Telephone records established communication between individuals. Witness statements clarified timelines. Emergency dispatch logs documented the sequence leading to the 911 call. Hospital records precisely recorded Anthony's condition upon arrival. Together, these independent sources formed a detailed chronology capable of withstanding scrutiny during trial. By late June 2018, detectives believed they understood what had happened. According to their investigation, Anthony had endured escalating abuse over several days before suffering fatal head injuries. The adults responsible for his care delayed obtaining emergency medical assistance until his condition became critical. Medical experts concluded that his injuries reflected abuse rather than accident. The evidence justified criminal prosecution. Heather Barron and Kareem Lava were arrested and charged with murder, accompanied by allegations that Anthony had been subjected to torture. Those arrests marked a major milestone. Yet public attention quickly shifted beyond the criminal defendants. Journalists began examining Anthony's extensive history with child welfare agencies. Investigative reporters obtained documents revealing years of hotline calls and official contacts. Questions that detectives had privately considered now entered national conversation. How could so many reports produce so little protection? Editorials criticized institutional failures. Community advocates demanded accountability. County officials ordered internal reviews. Anthony's death had become more than a homicide investigation. It had become a public reckoning. Within government offices across Los Angeles County, administrators began reviewing policies governing child abuse investigations. Communication between agencies came under particular scrutiny. Could information have been shared more effectively? Were risk assessment tools adequate? Did overwhelming caseloads contribute to missed warning signs? These questions would take years to answer fully. Some would never receive definitive answers at all. Meanwhile, prosecutors concentrated on preparing for trial. The criminal case would require presenting an enormous volume of evidence before a jury. Medical experts, detectives, child welfare records. Witness testimony. Photographs. Forensic findings. Every piece needed careful organization. The defense would challenge timelines, interpretations, and conclusions. The prosecution needed to demonstrate not only that Anthony had died from abuse, but that the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As preparations intensified, investigators reflected on one unavoidable truth. Anthony himself would never testify. The child whose voice should have mattered most had been permanently silenced. Instead, the evidence would speak for him. His medical records. His school reports. His injuries. The hotline calls made on his behalf. The observations recorded by teachers. The interviews conducted with siblings. The countless documents generated throughout his short life. Together, they formed a voice stronger than any single witness could provide. That voice would soon enter a courtroom, where 12 jurors would confront one of the most disturbing child abuse cases California had seen in decades. There, surrounded by evidence gathered through months of painstaking investigation, the search for justice would finally begin. By the time prosecutors formally began building their case, the investigation had already uncovered a mountain of evidence. Photographs documented Anthony Avallo's injuries. Medical records described the devastating condition in which he arrived at the hospital. Detectives had interviewed witnesses, family members, medical personnel, and investigators who had interacted with Anthony during the years before his death. Thousands of pages of records had been assembled into a single timeline. Yet every homicide investigation reaches a moment when scattered pieces finally connect. For Anthony's case, that breakthrough did not come from one dramatic confession or a single piece of forensic evidence hidden in the home. Instead, it emerged through the convergence of independent facts that all pointed toward the same conclusion. Medical science. Witness testimony. Historical records. Digital evidence. Previous reports. Each supported the others. Together, they formed a picture that became increasingly difficult to dispute. One of the most significant turning points came through the work of forensic pathologists. Their examination went far beyond identifying the immediate cause of death. Every injury was carefully documented. Every bruise was measured. Every wound was analyzed according to its age and characteristics. The findings carried enormous weight because they relied on physical evidence rather than memory. Human recollection can fade. Witnesses can become confused. Physical injuries cannot change their history. The medical evidence established that Anthony suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries responsible for his death were catastrophic. Equally important, the examination revealed numerous additional injuries in different stages of healing. Some were recent. Others were older. This pattern demonstrated that the violence extended well beyond Anthony's final day. The prosecution argued that his death represented the culmination of prolonged abuse rather than an isolated incident. Medical experts also addressed one of the central claims surrounding the emergency call. The explanation that Anthony had simply fallen could not adequately account for the overall pattern of injuries documented during examination. No single accidental fall could reasonably explain trauma of varying ages across multiple areas of the body. Scientific evidence became one of the strongest foundations of the prosecution's case. At the same time, detectives continued interviewing Anthony's siblings. Because the witnesses were children, investigators followed specialized procedures designed to reduce emotional harm while preserving the accuracy of their statements. Those interviews proved deeply important. According to testimony later presented during trial, Anthony's siblings described repeated punishments and violence inside the home. Their accounts helped establish that Anthony's fatal injuries were not the result of one unexpected outburst. Instead, prosecutors argued, they reflected an established pattern of abuse. For investigators, consistency matters. Independent witnesses describing similar events strengthen one another's credibility. When separate accounts align with medical evidence and documented history, they create a coherent narrative that becomes increasingly persuasive. Anthony's case contained precisely that combination. Another breakthrough came through the careful reconstruction of the family's history with child welfare authorities. Detectives and prosecutors reviewed years of reports submitted by teachers, relatives, neighbors, social workers, and law enforcement personnel. The reports originated from different individuals who often had no connection to one another. Yet the concerns repeated themselves. Physical abuse, neglect, visible injuries, starvation, fear. The repetition itself became evidence. It suggested that the allegations were not isolated misunderstandings. They reflected a persistent pattern observed by numerous independent people over several years. Investigators also examined the role of Heather Barron and Kareem Laver during Anthony's final days. Witness interviews, communication records, and forensic timelines allowed detectives to reconstruct events with increasing precision. The prosecution alleged that rather than protecting Anthony, both adults participated in or enabled the abuse. Their actions during the critical hours before emergency services were contacted also became a central focus. Medical experts testified that Anthony had suffered extensive injuries before the 911 call. That delay raised significant questions. Why was emergency assistance not requested sooner? What explanations were offered within the household? Did the adults appreciate the severity of Anthony's condition? Investigators compared every statement with the medical timeline. The evidence increasingly suggested that Anthony's injuries could not reasonably have been mistaken for a minor accident. As prosecutors organized the case, another emotionally significant element emerged. According to the prosecution, Anthony had disclosed shortly before the fatal abuse that he liked boys. The prosecution argued that this disclosure became part of the circumstances surrounding the escalation of violence. The allegation received widespread public attention because it highlighted another heartbreaking dimension of Anthony's vulnerability. Whatever thoughts or feelings Anthony had been trying to express, he remained a 10-year-old child seeking understanding from the adults closest to him. Instead, according to prosecutors, those adults responded with violence rather than protection. Although motive is not always required to prove murder, understanding why violence escalates often helps juries interpret behavior. The prosecution argued that Anthony's disclosure formed part of the context surrounding the final days of abuse. The defense, as expected, challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation. Throughout every major criminal trial, opposing attorneys examine evidence differently. Their role is to question assumptions, identify uncertainty, and test whether prosecutors have truly met the demanding legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That process is fundamental to the justice system. In Anthony's case, however, prosecutors believed the cumulative evidence was exceptionally strong. No single witness stood alone. No single medical finding carried the entire burden. Instead, dozens of independent facts reinforced one another. Medical conclusions matched witness testimony. Witness testimony aligned with historical records. Historical record supported the prosecution's timeline. Each layer strengthened the next. As preparations continued, prosecutors carefully selected expert witnesses capable of explaining highly technical evidence to jurors unfamiliar with forensic medicine or child abuse investigations. Medical experts translated complex anatomical findings into understandable language. Detectives explained investigative procedures. Specialists described how prolonged abuse differs from accidental childhood injuries. Every witness contributed another piece to the overall narrative. Outside the courtroom, Anthony's case continued attracting national attention. Investigative journalists examined the failures of child protection agencies. Public concern extended beyond the criminal prosecution. People wanted accountability not only from those accused of abusing Anthony, but also from institutions that had received repeated warnings before his death. County officials announced reviews. Independent investigators examined procedures. Questions surrounding DCFS and LASD became part of a broader public discussion about protecting vulnerable children. Still, prosecutors remained focused on the immediate task before them. Justice for Anthony depended first upon securing criminal convictions. Only after responsibility had been established could broader institutional reforms fully proceed. Months passed as both sides prepared for trial. Every photograph was reviewed. Every medical record examined. Every interview transcript analyzed. Prosecutors anticipated defense challenges and organized evidence accordingly. The goal was not merely to present facts. It was to present them in a sequence that allowed jurors to understand the full progression of Anthony's life and death. Chronology became essential. Jurors needed to see how repeated abuse culminated in fatal injuries. How years of warning signs preceded the final days. How medical evidence confirmed witness testimony. How every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. By the time jury selection approached, investigators believed they had accomplished something profoundly important. Anthony could no longer speak. Yet through careful investigation, his life had been reconstructed with extraordinary detail. His injuries became testimony. His medical records became evidence. His school history became context. His siblings' accounts became part of his voice. Every report filed during his childhood finally carried the significance it should have received years earlier. For detectives who had spent countless hours examining documents and interviewing witnesses, the investigation reached an emotional turning point. They understood that no verdict could restore Anthony's life. No sentence could erase the suffering he endured. Justice, in this case, could never mean making things right. It could only mean ensuring that the truth was fully exposed and that those legally responsible faced the consequences of their actions. The breakthrough, therefore, was not a single dramatic revelation. It was the realization that every fragment of Anthony's story, medical evidence, witness statements, historical reports, and forensic analysis fit together with remarkable consistency. The truth had been hidden for years, scattered across agencies and records that rarely intersected. Now, assembled into one comprehensive case, that truth stood ready to be presented before a jury. The next stage would no longer belong primarily to detectives. It would belong to prosecutors, defense attorneys, expert witnesses, and 12 citizens entrusted with one solemn responsibility. They would listen. They would examine every piece of evidence. And ultimately, they would decide whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt who was responsible for the death of Anthony Avalos, and whether justice, however imperfect, could finally begin after years of silence and unimaginable loss. When a criminal case reaches the courtroom, years of investigation are compressed into a story that must be told with clarity, precision, and evidence. Detectives who spent months collecting records step back. Forensic specialists prepare to explain complicated medical findings. Witnesses revisit painful memories. Attorneys organize thousands of pages of documents into a sequence that 12 jurors can follow. For Anthony Avalos, the trial represented far more than a legal proceeding. It was the first time the full story of his short life would be assembled in one place. Inside the courtroom, every decision, every report, every injury, and every missed warning would be examined under oath. The prosecution's responsibility was clear. They needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Heather Barron and Kareem Lava were criminally responsible for Anthony's death. That burden demanded more than emotion. It required evidence. Every allegation had to be supported. Every conclusion had to rest upon facts presented before the jury. The prosecution began by introducing Anthony not simply as a victim of homicide but as a 10-year-old child whose life had been marked by repeated abuse. Rather than focusing immediately on the final day, prosecutors carefully built a timeline stretching back years. Jurors learned about the repeated reports made by teachers, relatives, neighbors, and other mandatory reporters. They heard that concerns about Anthony had surfaced long before June 2018. Those earlier reports did not determine guilt by themselves. However, they provided context for understanding the pattern that prosecutors argued had ultimately led to Anthony's death. Medical testimony formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. Experienced physicians and forensic pathologists explained Anthony's injuries in careful, clinical language. Their testimony avoided speculation. Instead, it relied on anatomy, pathology, and documented observations. The jurors were shown that Anthony had suffered catastrophic head trauma, internal bleeding, extensive bruising, numerous injuries in different stages of healing. The medical experts explained why these findings were inconsistent with the explanation that Anthony had simply fallen. A single accident could not account for the overall pattern documented throughout his body. Each injury became another piece of scientific evidence. Unlike eyewitness testimony, physical evidence carries a unique weight in criminal trials. Bruises cannot exaggerate. Bones cannot misremember. Healing wounds cannot alter their timelines. The medical findings spoke with remarkable consistency. They supported the conclusion that Anthony's fatal injuries resulted from prolonged physical abuse rather than an isolated accident. Next came testimony from investigators. Detectives described the emergency response. They explained how the criminal investigation expanded after Anthony arrived at the hospital. Jurors heard about the examination of the family home, the collection of physical evidence, and the reconstruction of Anthony's final days. They also learned how investigators compared witness statements against medical evidence. Where inconsistencies appeared, detectives explained how additional investigation either confirmed or disproved those accounts. The prosecution emphasized that no single witness carried the entire case. Instead, the evidence resembled a mosaic. Each piece alone revealed only part of the picture. Together, they formed one coherent narrative. Perhaps the most emotionally difficult testimony came from Anthony's siblings. Because they were children, their participation required extraordinary care. The court took measures intended to reduce additional trauma while allowing relevant evidence to be presented. According to the prosecution, their testimony described repeated abuse within the household and helped establish that Anthony's suffering had not been confined to a single day. Every question posed to these young witnesses carried emotional weight. Courtrooms are designed for truth, not comfort. Yet in cases involving children, judges, attorneys, and jurors all recognize the profound burden placed upon young witnesses asked to describe painful memories. Their testimony became an important part of the prosecution's effort to establish the broader pattern of abuse. The prosecution also presented evidence concerning the final days before Anthony's death. According to their theory of the case, the violence escalated dramatically during that period. They argued that Anthony's disclosure to his mother that he liked boys formed part of the circumstances surrounding the abuse, although the criminal charges ultimately rested on the physical evidence demonstrating murder and torture rather than motive alone. Throughout the proceedings, the defense exercised its essential role within the justice system. Defense attorneys questioned witnesses. They examined investigative methods. They challenged interpretations of evidence. They sought to identify inconsistencies wherever possible. The adversarial process exists to ensure that criminal convictions rest upon proof rather than assumption. Every significant piece of evidence was therefore tested through cross-examination. Medical experts defended their conclusions. Detectives explained investigative decisions. Witnesses clarified earlier statements. The jury observed not only the evidence itself but also how each witness responded under questioning. As the trial progressed, the prosecution gradually returned to one central argument. Anthony's death could not be understood as an isolated event. His fatal injuries represented the culmination of repeated abuse inflicted over time. The medical evidence, witness testimony, and historical records all pointed toward the same conclusion. Closing arguments marked the final opportunity for both sides to address the jury. Prosecutors summarized months of testimony. They reminded jurors of the forensic evidence. They reviewed the documented pattern of injuries. They argued that Anthony had endured sustained abuse at the hands of the very adults responsible for protecting him. The defense urged jurors to evaluate the evidence carefully and to apply the high legal standard required before returning guilty verdicts. In every criminal trial, the presumption of innocence remains until guilt has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury then withdrew to deliberate. Behind closed doors, 12 citizens reviewed the evidence presented over the course of the trial. Jurors examined testimony, medical findings, photographs, documents, legal instructions provided by the judge. Their task was not to determine whether Anthony had suffered. That fact was tragically undisputed. Their responsibility was to determine whether the prosecution had proven the criminal charges against the defendants according to California law. When the verdicts were finally announced, the courtroom grew silent. The jury found Heather Barron and Kareem Lever guilty in connection with Anthony Avalos' murder. The verdict represented the conclusion of the criminal trial and the beginning of sentencing proceedings. For Anthony's surviving relatives, no verdict could erase years of grief. Justice in homicide cases is always limited. It cannot restore birthdays never celebrated. It cannot return stolen childhoods. It cannot allow a family to hear the laughter of a child who is gone forever. It can only establish accountability under the law. During sentencing, the court considered the extraordinary seriousness of the crimes. The abuse described throughout the trial had shocked not only the jury but also experienced investigators and prosecutors accustomed to violent cases. The court ultimately sentenced both Heather Barron and Kareem Lever to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of Anthony's death and ensured that neither defendant would be eligible for release. For many observers, the verdicts brought a measure of legal closure. Those directly responsible had been convicted. The criminal justice system had completed its work. Yet outside the courtroom, another conversation had only begun. Public attention increasingly shifted toward institutions that had encountered Anthony during his lifetime. Journalists revisited years of child welfare reports. Community advocates questioned why repeated warnings had failed to produce lasting protection. County officials faced difficult questions regarding communication between agencies responsible for investigating child abuse. The criminal trial had answered one question. Who was legally responsible for Anthony's murder? It had not fully answered another. Why had Anthony remained in danger despite years of documented concern? Those questions led to independent reviews, civil litigation, and policy discussions extending well beyond the criminal proceedings. Los Angeles County eventually reached a settlement with Anthony's family in a civil case, acknowledging the profound failures that had surrounded his protection. The settlement did not alter the criminal convictions. Instead, it reflected the county's recognition that broader institutional issues required examination. For detectives who had investigated the homicide, the verdict closed one chapter. For child protection professionals across California, Anthony's case became required reading. Training programs examined the investigation. Policymakers reviewed procedures. Communication between agencies became an area of renewed focus. Anthony's name gradually came to symbolize more than one heartbreaking crime. It became associated with the urgent need to recognize cumulative warning signs before they become irreversible tragedy. The courtroom had delivered justice as defined by law. But justice alone could never answer the deeper question that lingered after the final sentence had been imposed. Could Anthony's death have been prevented? For many people who studied the case, that question remained the most painful of all. As the legal proceedings came to an end and public attention slowly shifted away from the courtroom, Anthony's story entered a different chapter, one defined not by verdicts or prison sentences, but by reflection, accountability, and the lasting impact his short life would have on child protection systems throughout Los Angeles County and beyond. The criminal trial had ended. The verdicts had been read. Heather Barron and Kareem Lever had been sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in prison without the possibility of parole. For the justice system, the case had reached its formal conclusion. For everyone else, it was only the beginning. When the courtroom emptied and television cameras disappeared, one question refused to fade. How had Anthony Avalos remained in danger for so many years despite repeated warnings from so many different people? The answer could not be found inside the verdict. The jury had decided who was criminally responsible for Anthony's death. It had not been asked to decide whether government agencies had failed him. That conversation unfolded outside the criminal courthouse, in county offices, investigative newsrooms, community meetings, and eventually in civil court. Anthony's death triggered one of the most significant examinations of child protection procedures in Los Angeles County in recent years. The focus expanded far beyond one household in Lancaster. Attention turned toward every institution that had crossed paths with Anthony during his short life. Investigative journalists began requesting public records. Child welfare experts reviewed timelines. Advocacy organizations analyzed official responses. County supervisors demanded explanations. What emerged was deeply unsettling. Anthony's case was not one in which authorities first learned about abuse only after a child had died. Instead, reports stretched back years. Teachers had reported concerns. School counselors had noticed warning signs. Relatives had contacted authorities. Neighbors had spoken up. Law enforcement officers had documented incidents. Social workers had visited the home. Each report represented another opportunity. None ultimately changed the outcome. As more records became public, the scale of the missed opportunities became increasingly apparent. According to publicly available information, child abuse hotline reports concerning Anthony and his household had accumulated repeatedly between 2013 and 2018. Different individuals described similar concerns. Physical abuse, neglect, visible injuries, food deprivation, emotional mistreatment. No single report described every allegation later presented during the criminal trial. But taken together, they revealed a pattern that many observers believed should have prompted stronger intervention. The public reaction was immediate. Parents imagined their own children. Teachers questioned whether mandatory reporting laws were sufficient if repeated reports still failed to protect vulnerable students. Social workers reflected upon the impossible decisions they faced daily while balancing incomplete information, legal requirements, and overwhelming caseloads. Police agencies examined communication procedures with child welfare investigators. The case became a painful reminder that protecting children requires more than individual effort. It requires coordination. One agency may possess one important fact. Another agency may hold a second. A third organization may document a third concern. Unless those pieces come together quickly, the overall level of danger may never become fully visible. Anthony's life exposed precisely that challenge. One of the most heavily scrutinized organizations was the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. Internal reviews examined previous investigations involving Anthony's family. Questions centered on risk assessments. Were warning signs underestimated? Were interviews sufficiently thorough? Did investigators possess enough information to appreciate the full extent of the danger? No child protection system can guarantee perfect outcomes. Social workers routinely investigate thousands of allegations every year. Many reports ultimately prove unfounded. Others involve families struggling with poverty rather than abuse. Authorities must make difficult decisions using incomplete information under significant time pressure. Recognizing those realities does not eliminate accountability. Instead, Anthony's case challenged officials to determine whether existing procedures adequately identify children facing the highest levels of risk. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department also faced questions. Earlier contacts between deputies and Anthony's family received renewed attention. Investigators reviewed previous reports involving suspected abuse. Public discussion focused on whether earlier criminal investigations had been sufficiently comprehensive. Again, the issue was not simply one decision made by one individual. The broader concern involved communication, follow-up, and institutional learning. How should agencies respond when multiple reports accumulate over several years? How can investigators distinguish isolated family difficulties from escalating patterns of violence? Anthony's death transformed those questions from theoretical policy discussions into urgent public priorities. Meanwhile, Anthony's surviving family members faced a very different reality. Criminal convictions cannot restore what has been lost. Birthdays continued arriving each May. School years began and ended. Children who had once played alongside Anthony grew older. He remained forever 10 years old. For relatives who loved him, grief did not conclude when the trial ended. It simply changed. The criminal case had focused on evidence. Family members now confronted memory. Photographs. Holidays. Ordinary moments unexpectedly interrupted by absence. Child homicide leaves a unique emptiness. Adults often leave behind careers, friendships, and decades of shared experiences. Children leave behind possibilities. People mourn not only who they were but who they never had the chance to become. Anthony would never begin middle school. Never learn to drive. Never graduate. Never build an adult life. Every future milestone vanished with him. That reality became one of the most painful themes expressed by child advocates discussing the case. Anthony had not merely lost his life. He had lost every year that should have followed it. The county eventually faced civil litigation brought on behalf of Anthony's family. Unlike the criminal trial, which focused on individual guilt, the civil proceedings examined institutional responsibility. The lawsuit argued that county agencies had failed to protect Anthony despite years of documented warning signs. Civil cases operate under different legal standards than criminal prosecutions. Their purpose is not imprisonment. Instead, they seek accountability through the legal recognition of harm and, in many cases, financial compensation. In 2022, Los Angeles County agreed to a settlement totaling $32 million. The settlement represented one of the largest involving child welfare failures in the county's history. No amount of money could compensate for Anthony's death. County officials acknowledged as much. The settlement instead reflected recognition that profound failures had occurred and that meaningful reform was necessary. Alongside the settlement came renewed commitments to improving child protection. County leaders announced efforts to strengthen coordination between agencies. Information sharing procedures received increased attention. Training programs were expanded. Officials examined ways to identify high-risk cases earlier. Caseload management became another important topic of discussion. Many child welfare professionals had long warned that overwhelming workloads reduced the time available for thorough investigations. Anthony's case intensified those conversations. Advocates argued that protecting children requires not only better policies but also sufficient staffing and resources to implement them effectively. The impact of Anthony's story extended beyond California. Across the United States, child welfare organizations referenced his case during conferences, professional training, and policy discussions. It joined other well-known tragedies that prompted nationwide reflection about mandatory reporting, multidisciplinary investigations, and the importance of recognizing cumulative warning signs rather than evaluating each report in isolation. Educators also found themselves revisiting Anthony's story. Teachers occupy a uniquely important position because they interact with children consistently over long periods. Anthony's case reinforced the importance of documenting concerns carefully and continuing to report new observations even when previous reports appear to have produced little visible change. The lesson was difficult but essential. One report may not be enough. Repeated reporting can establish patterns that isolated incidents cannot. For medical professionals, Anthony's case highlighted the critical role hospitals play in identifying non-accidental trauma. Emergency physicians, pediatric specialists, nurses, and forensic pathologists all contributed essential evidence. Their work not only supported the criminal prosecution but also strengthened broader understanding of how prolonged abuse presents medically. Years after Anthony's death, his name continued appearing in discussions about child protection reform. Not because people wished to revisit tragedy. Because they hoped future children might be protected sooner. His story became part of training materials, policy reviews, academic discussions, legislative conversations. Each reference carried the same underlying purpose: to prevent another child from enduring the same fate. Anthony himself never had the opportunity to speak publicly. He never wrote about what he experienced. He never testified in court. His voice reached the world only through medical evidence, investigative records, school reports, and the people who tried to help him. Yet those fragments ultimately combined into something powerful. They changed procedures. They prompted reform. They forced uncomfortable conversations that many institutions had postponed for too long. In that sense, Anthony's legacy extended far beyond the courtroom. His story became a catalyst. Not for revenge. Not for sensational headlines. But for asking whether systems designed to protect children truly recognize danger before it becomes irreversible. The answers remain imperfect. Child abuse investigations continue to challenge professionals across the world. Every case presents uncertainty. Every decision carries enormous consequences. No reform can eliminate every tragedy. But every lesson learned from Anthony's life increases the possibility that another child, somewhere else, may be seen more clearly, heard more quickly, and protected before it is too late. That possibility became Anthony Avallo's enduring legacy, a legacy born from unimaginable suffering, yet one that continues to shape how communities, investigators, educators, physicians, and child protection professionals think about responsibility, vigilance, and the immeasurable value of a single child's life.